Hello, my name is Fernando. I'm a course developer at Udacity, and we're here today with Kendall. Kendall, will you please introduce yourself to our students?
My name is Kendall Gelner. I'm an independent iOS developer based in Denver, Colorado. I have my own small company called Kiki Software, and I do just iPhone and iPad development for a variety of different kinds of companies.
And what brought you to iOS development?
It was right around the time, really a few months before the launch of the App Store. I had been kind of playing around with Mac development for a little while, but when I first got the iPhone, I really knew that was going to be a big thing. Like I just could see that in my head, that apps would be amazing for that. And I actually fortuitously got laid off from my corporate IT job, just like maybe 6 or 7 months before the App Store. And at that point, I just decided to take the time after I got laid off to just shift all efforts to really learning iPhone development. And so I did that, and I actually released an app at the launch of the App Store. And that's how I got into iOS development to start with. And then almost immediately after, I shifted to consulting, but I was, I just kind of jump-started myself that way. So.
And what was that first app that you built?
It was called Checkout Smart Shop, actually. And so it was an app that let you scan in barcodes that it would look on Amazon or Target or other kind of local places and help you decide if a product maybe was around somewhere close to you or if it was better to get it through Amazon. So it was kind of an initial early shopping app.
And what you did is something that many wannabe iOS developers are planning to do or wish to do. What advice would you give to someone that wants to go solo or become an indie developer?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a bit harder today, especially product-wise. Like if you're trying to develop a product, like that's a much harder road to go than going in through consulting. And that's what I would say, because even now, I really don't have products anymore, and I'd really just do consulting work. And I would say if you're going to try and do products, you might want to start with consulting actually to see what's that's like working through companies, how it is that they build applications and what they do to really make applications really nice. And then from there, if you have good product ideas, you can try launching them kind of on the side or just at least have more of a base of understanding to really get into how to properly prepare for a good launch for an application.
I've been an indie developer in the past, and I made a mistake that I fear that many developers do. They want to go indie because I want to just code, and that's not what's going to happen. You will spend a lot more time doing marketing.
Right.
So,
and that's especially true, I think, now with the way the App Store is. I think there's actually a lot of potential still for App Store revenue and independent developers, but now more than ever, marketing is really a key strategy of that. You can't just rely, there's so many apps, people will never find you alone, and that's where marketing and some advertising and just kind of things like that are really crucial. And so and that's also a reason why I say maybe getting into consulting, because then you start by learning to sell yourself a little bit, and you learn what marketing is just in relation to your own services, and then you can extend that knowledge to maybe an application that you want to build.
Or maybe getting a marketing partner.
Right, or maybe finding good marketing partners, right, or other good people to help you kind of with the business end.
And if you could go back in time and meet your own self when you were starting with iOS development, would you have any tips for that developer?
Actually, I was honestly very pleased with how things kind of turned out. I think I would say that it would have been nicer at that time to focus more on product development a bit more. I wish I had stuck with the product stuff a bit longer and not so immediately moved in consulting at that point. But like I said, at this point, I don't know that that's really practical so much. So, but that's what I would have said to myself back then, because that was kind of a key position to be in. That was a really good moment to really be building products, because there was a wide field and it was not a lot of people in it yet. So, and there's probably still true in other parts of the App Store, just not overall. So.
Okay, and if one of our students is interested in going the consulting way, do you have any tips how to sell yourself, look for first clients?
Well, ironically, I mean, it does help to have your own app. So even if you you might think about working on some kind of a starting app, and even maybe if it's not quite good enough for the App Store or something, just to have an app that you could distribute to someone as a way of example of saying, oh, I did this and I've worked on these kinds of things. I think that's a big help, or maybe contributing to some open source frameworks. But basically, I think just the idea of building a usable application, start to finish, that maybe uses some data and other sort of more common frameworks within iOS would be a really good way to kind of edge into consulting. And then from there, you have something to show that you really can do what you're saying.
And having, so basically you're saying have a portfolio of sample apps that you can show to.
Right, exactly. That would be the thing. It's kind of like a portfolio app, maybe with even different segments showing off different things that you've learned with development, or just, or like I said, even just like a finished application is especially valuable, just to show that you can really build something start to finish, and you kind of know the whole span of iOS development, especially because things like provisioning and other aspects of iOS development are kind of quirky, and if you know those, you're actually ahead of the game of a lot of people that's too much trouble to learn. So.
And talking about provisioning, what do you think is the toughest part from in iOS development? What's the less pleasant?
Definitely provisioning is right up there, especially for someone fresh into it. And even myself, I encounter many frustrations with that over time. Apart from that, really that's one of the main things, but also just tooling can get frustrating too. Sometimes Xcode will crash or cause other problems. And another thing to be wary of is actually that there are a lot of third-party frameworks and things that will help you build stuff. But if you rely on them too much, you don't really understand well what is going on. And so that's actually kind of a danger. It's not really as much of a thing that makes it hard as say provisioning profiles, which are just naturally hard and kind of you stumble on them right off the bat. But they're the kind of thing that later on down the road, you just won't know something as well because maybe you used a third-party framework to help you accomplish something. So knowing how the underlying stuff works, and then maybe using a third-party framework on top of that, once you understand how things work, I think is actually very important.
I think that's great advice to our students. Having the whole frameworks that Apple provides us is enough of a black box, and you shouldn't be blindly adding stuff that you don't understand how it works. I got into that trouble in the past. It was horrible. So it's something that you really need to pay attention to. Don't add stuff that you don't understand completely. Talking about tools and frameworks, is there anyone that you would specifically recommend to our students?
You mean in terms of following or like research or?
No, something that you use and you think it's a valuable tool.
Oh, right. So actually, yes, there's one thing, which is there's a very nice code generator, which normally I never would use a code generator, but for core data, I make an exception, and there's this really nice code generator called Mogen.
Oh, yes.
Mogen.
Oh, yeah.
So Mogen has just been invaluable, really, to me over time, because Apple even has gotten better. They have tools in Xcode to generate core data objects for you. But even so, there's just some things that Mogen sort of builds for you out of the gate. Yeah. And it's flexible. It has a templating system, and you can configure what it's actually producing. And I think that will become important as Swift kind of rises, and people maybe want to tinker with what kinds of templated kind of objects core data generates, but in a Swift standpoint, actually. I think it will be a little bit of a nice thing as a transition happens to make it easier on you. And so that's the main one, actually, is that I do use that all the time. There's other things like actually the Scope software, Scope X, or do you remember? No, well, it's basically a screen measurement software that helps you measure pixels, exact pixels on screen.
Okay.
Currently, of course, Sketch is kind of the most useful sort of graphical design thing, so that's also a pretty good tool for iOS development now. And so if you can get a little bit of knowledge of that, it will help you work with designers too. And so that's pretty important. But basically, just even understanding Xcode and instruments is kind of really important, and a lot of people don't really go into depth as much as they could understanding just those tools. And understanding those tools really well helps you a ton, especially instruments actually, in analysis and things. So
yeah, since we got away from manual memory management, people kind of forgot about instruments because they don't need it.
Right.
As
you don't need it every day.
Every day, but when you need it, you really, really need it. So
Right.
that's definitely a great tip. Learn instruments, definitely. And talking about design, you mentioned something about design. Do you work with a designer? How do you?
Commonly, yes. I mean, since I work with a lot of different companies, they all have different approaches. I mean, some have in-house designers. Sometimes on a small project, I'll just be paired with another designer. But I do work with a lot of different design. Pretty much in every project, there's going to be a designer working with you and helping to build the app also. So.
And there's a tool called Paint Code.
Right, Paint Code. Yes, I've used that too.
That's also great. It's just in case it's a tool that allows you to design something, and instead of giving you an image, it gives you code that will create that image. So it's I usually tell my students it's either Paint Code or Paint Code, because writing core graphics.
That's true. For doing core graphic stuff, that's especially invaluable when you're trying to get something more dynamic and you want some initial code to help you build up some complex graphic. And then you can kind of manipulate it from there, but it's really great at kind of generating code for you like that.
And what kind of apps do you usually work on? What's the usual domain?
They're mostly kind of business to customer focused kinds of things. Like I've worked with larger consulting companies on sort of more mainstream sports applications. And currently I have a client that's doing really an enterprise level kind of store, supplier to store sales application. And I'm also working right now also with a signature analysis application and just a wide variety of stuff. Basically the only kind of thing I would say I don't really work on much is games. That's the one area that's pretty specialized, and so I just haven't looked at that as much. But every other area I've kind of done some things in, at least here and there, different frameworks and everything.
Okay, and if you were talking to someone who's just beginning right now, what are the tools, the frameworks, or technologies that you consider that are a must? You must know this if you want to become a senior iOS developer. Well, that's your career.
Sure. So, I mean, right off the bat, core data is super important. It's very complex and it can be very frustrating. But if you just understand that well, that will be a big help. And lots of companies do use core data, especially enterprise or consulting kind of companies. People that use consultants are often using core data, I would say. There are other frameworks, but to understand core data first even helps you understand why those other frameworks are valuable for you too. And so that's the main one. The other ones, actually really a lot of people, especially building more professional apps now, are very focused on good animations and that kinds of things. So really core graphics and core animation and just learning generally how to work with animation within your application to just kind of fine-tune how things shift around or how they present themselves initially. That can be very useful too. That will be a very valuable experience to a lot of companies. And that is actually something that a lot of more advanced developers would look for, is kind of proof that you understand the animation system and maybe you can do some more advanced things. So that's also very helpful. Some of the other frameworks that are useful, like core location, is pretty nice to know, but not used by everyone. Actually, the networking stack is very useful, like the CF networking, and just the NSURL connection and that kind of an NSURL session, especially, is a more modern approach to that. And to understand NSURL session is great because that's an area where prior to the really NSURL session, a lot of people used other third-party frameworks to do networking in iOS. That's not really true anymore, and so you should really, I think, steer away from third-party frameworks at the moment for networking kind of stuff and really just figure out NSURL session and how to use that for almost anything you want to do. On top of that, the biggest one is really just some kind of JSON. Working with JSON and server APIs is super important because almost everything now has some degree of interaction with some kind of server or stuff on the cloud. And so understanding JSON and how to work with that data coming into and out of the app is very important, I'd say. So that's the other one.
As for languages, are you more of a Objective-C or Swift kind of guy? Where do you stand?
Currently, I really work in both. It's interesting, actually. My large enterprise client that I'm working with currently, they actually shifted to Swift almost immediately after Swift was launched. And so now, I work with Swift almost all the time. I still work with Objective-C to some degree, kind of a mixture back and forth and actually some calling each other. But I definitely would say, Swift is definitely the future. In the same way that you could look at auto layout before a while ago and say, well, that's pretty nice, but it's not really working that great. But to learn it at that point was super important because Apple just keeps on pushing, basically. And Apple's direction is auto layout, so it was really good to learn auto layout because now, it's more settled and everyone uses it. Or, well, maybe not everyone, but it's very popular now. And in the same way, Swift, you can just tell Apple's moving everything that way. There will still be a lot of Objective-C stuff for a long time. And actually, I love the language. I really love Objective-C, but I also love Swift. It's okay to love more than one language. Even beyond that, there's many other languages I'm very fond of. And remember that all the languages have their good and downsides, and just kind of learn what is good in each. But really, it's right now for iOS development, especially Swift focus is, I think, very important.
As for WWDC, considering what we've seen so far, what do you think is more exciting or more important at this point?
Well, what I'm really excited by is not just any one announcement, but sort of the cloud of announcements around extensions. I really think that it's great that Apple's opening up even more parts of the system, and I think that will really change a lot more how people kind of work with the applications. Especially using iMessage with all these different messaging applications, and it opens up some possibilities for kinds of applications that really couldn't necessarily be done before because of people's reluctance to use third-party apps for just going to an app to do one task. But now within some of the stock Apple apps, you'll be able to do some tasks that you just wouldn't have been able to directly there before. And that opens up, I think, the greatest possibility, and is the most interesting aspect to me, is just what is possible with these many new extensions that are now available.
And would you recommend a beginner developer to attend WWDC, OutConf, or any technical conference?
Actually, the technical conferences are great because you meet so many people that do different things, and they're especially great at understanding how people do things. And each is different kind of, in their own way, they're useful. Like WWDC is nice to hear the way that Apple, kind of recommends that you go. And that's good to hear because in the future, those are always kind of hints as to where Apple is headed, and they can help you understand sort of how to better prepare for the future. And other conferences like AltConf or just other general third-party iOS conferences are great because you get speakers that are really seasoned in how to use the frameworks as they are. So you get an understanding of just the best practices of how people are using what exists today. And so it's actually kind of nice to meld the two. Like it's really super important to watch the WWDC videos to understand the future, but then to understand the present and then to kind of mingle those two together, I think is great. And I'm especially happy that so many conferences now, they have videos all over. It's just really easy to get a lot of great content from all over now.
When you develop an app for a client, most applications right now need some kind of a server side or backend. Do you also do that part? Do you use
I used to do that part, but I have not for a while. I actually probably will now that server-side Swift has become more available, just because I have done a lot of Java in the past and I was able to do that. But just because there has been so much demand for iOS development, and on teams I've generally been partitioned out into just doing kind of more client-side work. And I have worked closely with server-side developers because I understood well how to build the server APIs and everything, and just kinds of things that the mobile client would need to have the API work better with it. But I haven't had for a couple of years really the chance to work on the server aspect. But definitely with Swift going in now, and especially more of like CloudKit things that help you manage some of the server things that you might have done otherwise before. There's a lot of different ways now that even an independent developer working on one thing can really have a server component that does meaningful things, I think.
Especially if you have the same language from top to bottom.
Right, that does help. Like I said, I enjoy using multiple languages, but definitely, context switching is hard, and if you can use one language for all those things, it is nice. And I think Swift is actually very applicable to server-side work too. It's a little bit early, so it's kind of rough to use it that way, but I think that Swift, the language, is also a pretty good one for server development too.
Okay, so you think that's a skill that will be marketable in the future?
I think eventually. That might take a few years, but I do think that's a possible future, right? Is just even Swift server developer could be, like an area of focus that would have some potential.
What's the biggest advantage of attending a technical conference such as OutConf, WWDC? What would you recommend our students?
Sure. Well, really, the differences between something like DubDub and something like AltConf or other third-party iOS conferences is that WWDC is kind of the future of iOS development. It's kind of showing you where Apple's headed, and so that's important to know. Whereas something like AltConf or other iOS conferences, they're giving you seasoned developers' viewpoints on how to use what Apple already has in place. And the great thing is now is that really almost all these conferences are presenting videos online, and so it's very easy for students. They don't have to, if they can't afford to go to a conference or it's just not practical for them to travel somewhere, then it's very easy now, especially WWDC is live streaming and they have videos after, but almost all the smaller conferences now have, AltConf, for example, is recording all the sessions and you can watch them later, and so you can get all of the conference material now just at home, and it's a tremendous wealth of information now that it was hard to get before. You did have to go to conferences, and now any student can go and find just a ton of good information. So
yeah, so you can get all the information. But if possible, I would recommend actually attending, because there is also the networking part
That's true, and there is a lot of networking involved, so if possible, it is great to come to something. You meet a lot of interesting people from all over, and you find out more about talking to them about how they work on things, and it gives you an even broader scope of understanding of just what people are doing these days in different application development. So that part is very useful as well. That's true. So if possible, it is good to go to a conference, but if you can't, at least you can do a lot of learning and kind of do good all that way. So. And
just a last question, do you have any favorite app, something that you use every day?
Well, let's see here. I actually use Waze all the time for driving. Okay. As a driving assistant, I love that thing, I have to say. I do use Slack a lot because I'm on a lot of different teams, and so something like Slack is very useful to me to kind of keep track of what is going on within different teams. And apart from that, I use a variety of different photography apps. I enjoy photography, and I like using a little bit some of the more advanced photo apps, so just kind of here and there.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for
sure. Well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
So interview, and it's always a pleasure to meet another MoGenerator fan.
Oh yes,
because I'm a rabid fan of that tool. So
yeah, that's been helpful for so long. I really appreciate what that has helped me with. So. Okay.